Thank you, Dr. McMahon, for introducing this topic of culture. That was really great. And I can't wait for the discussion we have after my lecture here. So thank you all for being here again. Here goes. I'm going to start off by telling you a little story. My husband and I got married when we were quite young, and so we decided to save up our money for a few years and travel before settling down. I waited tables, worked as a stagehand, directed some plays, apprenticed at Ridgeview with Dr. McMahon, which is where I met him. And I was about to begin looking for a teaching job or applying to grad school when the time to take off had come. We booked some one-way tickets and set off on what would become a 7-month-long epic adventure in England, Scotland, France, Belgium, and Norway. We found that we could find jobs that would let us work for room and board through various service websites, and so we could afford to stay abroad for longer. We worked at a bike shop in Edinburgh, an inn on the Isle of Mull, a 16th century farm in southern France where we did nothing but cat sit, that was really easy, and an arts commune in Evanger, Norway. So I want to talk to you about Norway for a minute. Our work at the Norwegian establishment was simple. Make art, converse and collaborate with other artists in residence, and occasionally serve an espresso to the curious public. So I had to find an art project to work on in order to earn my keep. As a theatrical directing student at Hillsdale College, I studied Hedda Gabler, which is a play by a Norwegian playwright from the turn of the century named Henrik Ibsen, and I really liked his plays for a lot of reasons, but I liked their indictment of social conformity, the stark realism in contrast to the Victorianism that abounded at the time, and also all references to Norse mythology. So I set my sights on writing my own translation of one of Ibsen's most political plays called An Enemy of the People. Well, I won't tell you the whole story right now. I'll tell you that its protagonist is, he's a guy who swims against current popular opinion in pursuit of what he thinks is right. And the whole story is about how he's knocked down and maligned by members of his own community and government, how he's chided by teachers and elders and even his family members. So I became kind of obsessed with this idea about a society that suppresses critique, exceptionalism, and talent in lieu of conformity, averageness, and mediocrity. I began thinking, what kind of person does this society wish to produce? In discussing this topic with everybody, and one of the Norwegian residents of the town we lived in mused, "Oh yeah, of course, that's the Law of Jante." I had never heard of this before. So I started bringing up this idea at communal meals, and each person in the commune, Tommaso, the Italian sculptor, Miriam, the Dutch yogi, my husband, the American instrument maker, all of them thought that this was the prevailing problem in their home country. So this Law of Jante, this idea of enforced mediocrity, where does it come from? Well, the Law of Jante as a term comes from the Danish satirist and novelist Sandemos, who accidentally coined the term that came to be a shorthand in Scandinavia and then around the world for society-enforced mediocrity, or a condescending attitude towards individuality coming from the group. He introduced this term in his novel A Fugitive Crosses His Tracks, published in 1933. The novel wasn't very good, but in it, a fictional town called Jante, which was modeled on Sandemos' own hometown, had a plaque outside the town hall, and it had these 10 commandments. So the Law of Jante said, "You are not to think you are anything special. You are not to think you are as good as we are. You are not to think you are smarter than we are. You are not to convince yourself that you are better than we are. You are not to think you know more than we do. You are not to think you are important. You are more important than we are. You are not to think you are good at anything. You are not to laugh at us. You're not to think anyone cares about you. You're not to think you can teach us anything." So the Law of Jante as a shorthand for enforced mediocrity stuck, and this concept comes up all the time in the last 100 years or so. Paulo Coelho, the author of The Alchemist, relies on this concept in criticizing his native Brazil in his book Like a Flowing River, and lots of other examples of the Law of Jante popping up as a term. My point is that this feeling is ubiquitous across countries, across cultures, and across times. I see it in America. Tommaso Tommaso sees it in Italy, Miriam sees it in Holland, Paulo Coelho sees it in Brazil, and Sandemos, the guy who came up with the idea, saw it in his own Danish village at the turn of the century. So this problem is a culture that seems to reward conformity and compliance, to disdain intellectual pursuits and knowledge for its own sake, and to regard education as a commodity or a means to an end through enforced mediocrity. But the question is why? Like, who does this benefit, and how can this be avoided? I'm going to address these issues each in turn, not to dwell on the negative, but rather to elucidate maybe some of the reasons our hypothetical, cultureless young man in Dr. McMahon's social experiment is probably just going to die alone, right? Okay. At the end, I hope each of you will discover for yourself a way, big or small, of combating this anti-intellectualism on a daily basis. Although it might seem like I'm just throwing shade on our culture, I want you to leave with a clear idea of what our problems are and a view to combat anti-intellectualism in your own way. Most of my examples will be drawn from articles and books on education, mostly high school and college education, because I want to draw a clear connection between the cultural shifts towards sameness and the parallel shifts in contemporary philosophy of education. I'm sure that you'll be able to leap with me from analyzing our topic as it applies to education, and then as it applies to daily life, like we did just a moment ago with Dr. McMahon. So one question we'll consider as we go is, which came first, a culture of mediocrity that enforces its conformist values on a public education system, or an education system that simply trains young people to conform? And spoiler alert, we will not solve this one. But I hope it leads to some lively debate following my lecture. Maybe you have some ideas. Okay, let's first tackle the first law of Jante, which states, you are not to think you are anything special. Ironically, public education seems to tell everyone they are special and unique all the time, while still treating them as numbers and making academic decisions more and more based on standardized tests. The word standardized implies average. In a recent interview, Todd Rose, an author, spoke about his new book called The End of Average. He says, we've come to embrace a way of thinking about ourselves as people that was intentionally designed to ignore all individuality and force everything in reference to an average person. Admissions officers, HR departments, banks, and doctors make life-changing decisions based on averages. Rose goes on to say that this works really well to understand the system or the group, but it fails miserably when you need to understand the individual, which is what we need to do in education. And sure, it's practical to measure the reading skills of a 7th grader, for instance, and make sure they can all process words on the page. But how this measurement is done is more important than why. Todd Rose goes on to tell a story about when the Air Force designed cockpits in the 1940s, they based all the measurements on the average pilot's measurements. There was an unacceptable number of crashes, so they went back to the drawing board and then measured thousands of pilots across 10 body dimensions, and found that 0 of them actually came close to the average on all 10. So when it comes to humans, there is no average that serves the individual. As a bit of a romantic, I find this beautiful and worth celebrating. That average only allows us to understand the group, the mass, or the herd. But in schools, textbooks and standardized tests, more appropriately, are designed to be age appropriate. But what does that really mean? And how can we know what the average kid knows or should know? Tests that are designed for the average would be a pretty bad fit for most kids. So of course there are curriculums like Core Knowledge that try to combat this by proposing instead a list of common books, concepts, and content, but not without harsh criticism. E.D. Hirsch, founder of the Core Knowledge curriculum we teach here, denounces the teacher who withholds material from his or her student because it's not developmentally appropriate. This enforcement of average through standardized tests is just one way the first law of Jante is enacted in our public school system. Moving on to the second law of Jante, and I'm not going to go through all 10, but I'm just going to use this one. The second law of Jante says, you're not as good as you are not to think you're as good as we are. The subsequent statements in the law of Jante, like you're not to think you know more than we do, you're not to think you're good at anything, they all serve to introduce this topic of enforced conformity. So we're just going to lump them all together. We're not going to go through them one at a time. All of these laws not only incent conformity, but punish exceptionalism. Furthermore, this institutionally mandated measurement of school children against an arbitrary standard Public schools tend to teach school more than anything else to cement these conformist values. Here's what I mean. In John Taylor Gatto's brilliant articles Against School and the Six-Lesson School Teacher, he brazenly asserts that most school children in America really only learn 6 lessons through their 12-year sentence, as he called it. All right, so here's what you learn. Stay in the class where you belong, turn on and off like a light switch on command, surrender your will to a predestined chain of command. Only the teacher will determine what curriculum you are studying. Your self-respect should depend on an observer's measure of your worth. And last, you are always being watched. Gatto's assertion is that the current education system does little more than mass-produce compliant citizens with an attitude of defeat, conformity, and fear. He also stridently remarks that despite current public debate on creating a national curriculum, we already have one that predictably produces moral and intellectual paralysis. I think Gatto sees the very obvious connection between this kind of conformity in education and the effect it has on culture when he writes, "We as a society are increasingly under central control in the United States since just before the Civil War. The lives we lead, the clothes we wear, the food we eat, the green highway signs we drive by from coast to coast are the products of this central control. So too, I think, are the epidemics of drugs, suicide, divorce, violence, cruelty, and the hardening of class into caste in the U.S. Products of the dehumanization of our lives, the lessening of individual and family importance that central control imposes. Without a fully active role in community life, you cannot develop into a complete human being. Aristotle taught that. Surely he was right. And look around you now. This is a demonstration. You, 20 people who showed up, are participating in community life here at Liberty. So well done, you. You're here. Although public education is ostensibly supposed to make good people, good citizens, and help each person achieve his personal best, H.L. Mencken satirically disagreed when he wrote in the American Mercury in 1924 that the real aim of public education, so he's joking, guys, the real aim of public education was not to fill the young of the species with knowledge and awaken their intelligence. Nothing could be further from the truth. The aim is simply to reduce as many individuals as possible to the same level, to breed and train a standardized citizenry, to put down dissent and originality. That is education's aim in the U.S. So that's satire. While Mencken's sarcastic remarks are designed to criticize the function of compulsory education, Alexander Inglis, a forefather of standardized testing, and this guy's being serious, this is not satire, just to be clear. He wrote in his 1918 book, Principles of Secondary Education, that the purpose of modern schools had nothing to do with knowledge, but rather served a few social functions, like reflexive obedience, determining a student's proper social role, and finishing the process of natural selection. You stop, oh yeah. So if you stop and think about that one for a few moments, like some of you just did, it will give you the willies. These ideas are inherited from the Prussian system on which our school system is based. An education system deliberately designed to produce mediocre intellects, to hamstring the inner life, to deny students appreciable leadership skills, and ensure docile and incomplete citizens, all in order to render the populace manageable, according to Gatto. Some of the outcomes of this kind of school are obvious, others less so. I highly recommend the works of John Taylor Gatto if you're a parent and you'd like to know what your student might do all day at a public school, if you're a student and you'd like to know what they're doing to you, or if you're a teacher and you'd like to have an existential crisis. Actually, in preparing for this talk, I did have moments of doubt about my own idealized view of education and how it could work within a traditional school like this one, or even how it could work at all. I shared my crisis with one of my students, and she blithely responded, "Yeah, I think it's good my teachers can have an existential crisis about teaching. That's a good sign." And somehow, strangely, this reassured me. Her remarks affirmed that she valued how much I examined my approach to the vocation of teacher with care and a healthy dose of trepidation. So living what we teach, the title of this lecture, really stems from this idea. I think that all the teachers here have reverence for what we're doing. And obviously, I think that constrained, small, and intentional schools like ours don't necessarily fit into all of these broad general observations about school, yet we should still always be asking ourselves if we do. So, to recap, through standardized testing that measures students against averages, and through the regimented and anti-intellectual view that school is about learning to do school rather than learning content, conformity is enforced and perpetuated by our school system, if not perhaps created by it. The implication of a state-run system that produces compliant citizens is the stuff of the next best-selling young adult dystopian novel you guys are all going to be crazy about. But it is certainly not a system that any of us really want to be a part of. So why this anti-intellectualism? Why are many in our country so suspicious of knowledge and the knowledgeable? Why is a political candidate laughed off of a debate for being too learned, or a bright student bullied for being excited about vectors, or a young woman snickered at for using a word with more than 2 syllables during her Miss America interview? Why this aversion to knowledge? I said we were going to examine the sort of chicken or the egg question of what came first. Is it anti-intellectualism in culture, enforcing conformity in schools, or vice versa? We don't know the answer, but we're going to keep asking this question. However, I do think that anti-intellectualism in culture has manifested in education in a really profound way. Susan Jacoby, author of The Age of American Unreason, says in an article in the Washington Post that dumbness has been steadily defined downward. I love that. For several decades, by a combination of heretofore irresistible forces. Okay, so what Jacoby is saying is that dumb now is dumber with every passing year. You guys get that? Okay. A few decades ago, a person was considered uneducated if he or she didn't know Homer, for instance. And now dumb means not knowing the capital of Maryland or who wrote the Declaration of Independence. Jacoby says that dumbness defined steadily downwards can be blamed on many different forces. So these include the triumph of video culture over print culture, a disjunction between Americans' rising level of formal education and then their shaky grasp of basic geography, science, and history, and the fusion of anti-rationalism with anti-intellectualism. Many people have a defiantly defeatist attitude to intellectualism and critical thinking. According to American psychology, an anti-intellectual society will have large swaths of people who are motivated by fear, susceptible to tribalism and simplistic explanations, incapable of emotional maturity, and prone to violent solutions. What Americans rarely acknowledge is that many of their social problems are rooted in the rejection of critical thinking, or conversely, the glorification of the emotional and irrational. But we're going to rein it in from American psychology for a moment, and from this big, broad definition, and look at how anti-intellectualism has infiltrated the canon of literature as well as culture, because that's my thing. So, take for example a recent article in the Wall Street Journal calling for Shakespeare's plays to be translated into real English. So here's what it says in the Wall Street Journal. It is true that translated Shakespeare is no longer Shakespeare in the strictest sense. But are we satisfied with Shakespeare being genuinely meaningful only to an elite few, unless edited to death or carefully excerpted, with most of the rest of us genuflecting in the name of culture and keeping our confusion to ourselves? Should we have to pore laboriously over Shakespeare on the page before seeing his work performed? So to me, this article is evidence of anti-knowledge in the news because teachers, who are people who dictate and design what students learn in school, have this attitude and are telling students that they're really just too dumb to read original sources. Students are given watered down, abridged, or updated versions of great works of literature instead of the original. And what kind of message does that send to students? Teachers present students with a defeatist attitude when they say, oh, you'll never really understand Shakespeare, so let me just tell you what happens in the play, and spoiler, no spoilers, he kills himself, they all kill themselves, or whatever, there's no. So, the teacher's saying, you'll never understand Shakespeare, so let me just tell you what it means, and also what you should think about it. Oh, and by the way, here's how you should feel about it too. Go home. So, can we blame students for being detached from their own education when even those teaching them don't really think they're up to it? Or maybe the teachers themselves might not even invite the challenge of reading the original text. This is just one of the examples. It's a pet example of mine. This is just one of the many examples of anti-knowledge attitudes in the news lately. So, anti-rationalism and anti-intellectualism are certainly serious problems, but I'd like to go even deeper than that and discuss the ways that our current culture avoids discussions of morality and teaches students to study works of literature at arm's length and with judgment rather than self-reflection, and thereby drains the life from the humanities in the process. Because I think all of these things are part of the same problem. By taking the humanness from the humanities, their popularity among college students is quickly dwindling. Higher education is experiencing a sort of industrial revolution, a shift towards viewing education as a mechanistic means to an end, and away from understanding humanity and our place in it. And I will propose a counter-revolution, if you stick around. After discussing the commodity approach to education at the end, I'll complete this lecture by defending my beloved humanities and making a case for why the humanities are the last hope for humanity. So, back to anti-intellectualism. Okay, so we can find many reasons for the current state of things, but no matter how you think we've become anti-science, anti-rational, anti-intellectual, whatever, I think we can at least agree that this is a trend. With this comes a detachment from the subject study, and consequently an insidious apathy towards self-knowledge. This dumbness, as Susan Jacoby says, can be as benign as a disinterest in challenging discussions, distaste for reading, for enjoyment, an annoyance at big words, or it can be as threatening as an outright denial of scientific studies, a tendency to double down on a biased perspective rather than a desire to find the truth, or a hatred of things one does not understand and a deep suspicion of those who try to learn things they don't know. You need only turn on any major news outlet to find evidence of this. This culture has changed the way students study the humanities and affects the number of students who choose to pursue them. This anti-knowledge attitude has rooted deeply so as to become not just anti-knowledge but anti-self-knowledge. So personally in my own life, my moral compass, my entire worldview has been shaped by what I have read, because by reading great content, I not only increase my knowledge, but most importantly, I get to know myself better. But by reducing knowledge to skills and self-reflection to self-improvement and judgment, demanding trigger warnings to avoid that which makes us uncomfortable, our education system and our culture has systematically removed the humanness from the humanities. When a book is not really allowed inside, not invited to mold a student's soul, it simply stays a text or just words on a page. Students are no longer taking art, history, literature, and philosophy personally, and I believe that's the only way to take them. So let me give you an example from my life. I love Shakespeare. Sorry, all my examples are going to be about Shakespeare. As many of you know, in fact, I'm directing a 5-actor Hamlet with students at Liberty, and the show's on April 29th and 30th. Talk to me afterwards about tickets. So, I love Shakespeare. I was lucky enough to find a group of graduate students of literature, English teachers and professors, and writers who convene monthly to discuss classical works. I was thrilled to join the group because the first discussion was on Macbeth, one of my favorite plays and one I spent 2 weeks studying this summer at Columbia University in New York. I was so geeked out and ready to share my thoughts and add to my understanding of the play, got there early, and met this wonderful, lovely group of exceedingly well-read, articulate, and passionate people. We talked about everything. We discussed Shakespeare's shaky patronage, the history of Scottish clans and political governance. We discussed witchcraft, misogyny, marriage laws. We discussed the imagery of clothing, blood, paternal relationships. We discussed the scansion, the meter, the lyrics. In summation, we talked intelligently for 2 hours about a play whose main themes are ambition, murder, marriage, the unbridled lust for power, barbaric selfishness, misguided devotion, manipulation, destiny, and so, to be more and less specific, good and evil, without ever once mentioning the existence of morality. Not one of these learned participants asked the question, how does this affect me? What did Macbeth do that was wrong? What was his sin? How does this change me? How strange that a work of art created from the form of humans about the form of human nature could even be discussed without any discussion of the golden mean of virtue. How odd that these lovely intellectuals, professional academics, were so caught up in the study of the text analysis, viewing through lenses, and so forth, that none of them stopped to acknowledge how the play held a mirror up to nature or made them reflect on their own mortality. I argue that this dearth of reflection stems from our anti-knowledge culture. After all, what's the purpose of any intellectual pursuit if it doesn't help us learn of our own humanity? The analytical exercise of studying literature gets old really fast when it has no bearing on oneself. This hollow study and lack of reflection is what has pushed so many students away from studying the humanities, specifically literature. Gary Saul Morson wrote an article and commentary called Why College Kids Are Avoiding the Study of Literature, in which he diagnoses 3 reasons students avoid studying literature these days in lieu of majors that promise lucrative jobs. All 3 reasons he gives rise from our culture's anti-knowledge attitude and academia's fear of examining literature in a profoundly personal way. The first reason Morson claims students are avoiding the liberal arts is the technical approach prevalent in collegiate study of literature. So obsessing on answering the questions, who's the protagonist? What does that tree symbolize? Is that some foreshadowing I detect? This approach is so focused on the text, it misses the fact that a literary work is the reader's experience. By focusing only on the techniques the writer employs or the formal analysis, the reader misses the true characters in a novel. What is lost in the technical approach is the heart of studying literature, the time to read and wonder about being in the circumstances of words on a page. He says the second way to kill interest in literature is death by judgment. One faults or excuses the author, character, or society depicted according to the moral and social standards prevalent today, by which he means those standards shared by professional interpreters of literature. We've all heard of viewing literature through various lenses, right? In fact, in most of my college classes, a literature paper was not really considered scholarly unless whatever you were writing about was viewed through a lens. Post-colonialism, racial and gender identity, reader response, semiotic, whatever, anyone will do really. So, for instance, when I was at the roundtable discussion that Beth was just telling you about, one particular participant was really interested in how Shakespeare was working for King James, and therefore interpreted every depiction of the Scots and the English leaders as either propagandistic or obsequious flattery of one kind. One participant only wanted to discuss Lady Macbeth's actions as a necessary byproduct of an oppressive patriarchy. Another only was interested in the violent religious suppression of heresies at the time, and how the witches in the play were a manifestation of popular superstitions and misogyny. While all of these are totally fascinating and awesome, no singular view of the play really makes it meaningful or works towards a greater understanding of our own human condition, which is what literature must be allowed to do. Without discussing the meaning, the rightness or the wrongness of characters' actions, our discussion spun in many, sometimes overlapping spirals, but it never really landed home where literature discussions should roost, in the heart and in the head. At best, each participant left feeling supercilious and as if his or her lens was the right one, through which everyone should study Macbeth. So, now, I'm not saying that the study of literature should be didactic, teaching lessons on how one should act and trying to manufacture proper behavior. I don't think that's its primary purpose. But in this judgmental approach, however, the more that authors and characters share our beliefs, the more enlightened they are. This is a simple form of ahistorical flattery, as Morson says. It makes us the wisest people who ever lived, much more advanced than Dickens or that Shakespeare guy or whoever. But I think that what makes a work literary is that it is interesting to people who do not care about its original context. For instance, the face-off between Madame Defarge and Miss Pross in A Tale of Two Cities is a heart-wrenching, violent, dramatic scene full of loyalty, malice, courage, even if you don't know the first thing about the French Revolution. If one does not allow these other perspectives to show the limitations of our own, literature easily becomes pointless. The third way this approach to studying literature kills books is by treating them as documents of their time. This approach treats all books neutrally, chastising those who might call some books great books or classics. This approach preaches that there are only things called great literature because hegemonic forces of oppression have mystified us into believing in objective greatness, Whereas intrinsically, Shakespeare is not really all that different from a laundry list or any other document. If this sounds exaggerated, let me cite the most commonly taught anthology among literature professors, the Norton Anthology of Theory and Criticism, which some of you might have had in college. Its editors paraphrase a key tenet of the dominant movement called cultural studies, which has set the critical agenda. So here's this little excerpt from Norton, beginning of the book, that says, "Literary texts, like other artworks, are neither more nor less important than any other cultural artifact or practice. Keeping the emphasis on how cultural meanings are produced, circulated, and consumed, the investigator will focus on art or literature insofar as such works connect with broader social factors, not because they possess some intrinsic interest or special aesthetic values." In other words, what used to be called masterpieces are worthy of study only insofar as they fit into a liberationist program and no further. If elements of popular entertainment illustrate social forces better than Pope or Proust do, then they should, and sometimes do, constitute the curriculum. The study of literature is then reduced to the study of documents. So when Huckleberry Finn becomes obsolete, we'll substitute in the shooting script for Breaking Bad, or the storyboards for Family Guy, or cat videos. So, to recap this section, anti-intellectualism and anti-knowledge attitudes deepen into anti-self-knowledge and contentless study of every subject, not just literature, with a removed and therefore impersonal attitude of technicality, judgment, or historicity. William Dereskowitz wrote in his perfectly titled book, Excellent Sheep, that students no longer experience the fruits of intellectual pursuits and really allow them to change their character. Study has become depersonalized because we don't talk about what really matters, the formation of a human being through the study of humanities with the humanities. When reading and learning is only about examining work through various lenses, criticizing history and condemning the past, we learn nothing of ourselves in the present. When content is examined at arm's length, it's easy for students to view their own education with a sense of commodity. The system manufactures students who are smart, talented, and driven, yes, but also anxious, timid, and lost, with little intellectual curiosity and a stunted sense of purpose, trapped in a bubble of privilege, heading meekly in the same direction, great at what they're doing, but with no idea why they're doing it. This commodity approach to education William Dereskowitz mentions is the third of my three problems I want to tackle today. We've talked about the dangers of prizing conformity and how anti-intellectualism, lack of content-rich education that teaches one to become him or herself, leads students to never really gain the self-knowledge real education should reward. This cycle completes itself in a commodity approach to education. When students don't really understand the point of education, it's easy for them to approach it as just another hoop they must jump through to get the material things they want out of life, or more often what their parents want for their child's life. Oh, it just makes it worse. All the grading. As you can see, meaning is lost in an absurd mangle of obscurity. I have no idea what any of those mean. Simon Winchester, writing in The Atlantic in 2001, gave the example of a student who attempted to improve the phrase, his earthy fingers, by changing it to his chthonic digits. Elsewhere, he calls the thesaurus a calculator for the lexically lazy. Used too often, relied on at all, it will cause the most valuable part of the brain to atrophy, the core of human expression to wither. In all these examples, the student's purpose is not clarity of expression, but to rack up points in his or her commodity approach to education. In a commodity-oriented approach to school, achievement, points, grades, and rank become the currency. This commodity approach creates more students who are good at school, thus reinforcing the conformity we started talking about. Students think that education is something they can accept passively. I hope that you see the cyclical nature of this, all these three things I talked about, and now understand why I don't think we can really answer the question of what came first, a culture of mediocrity that enforces its conformist values, on a public education system or an education system that simply trains young people to perform. So now you see the cycle we're up against, the vortex that our hypothetical young man finds himself stuck in. What can we do? I think it's really quite simple. Value education. Take your education rather than treat it like a commodity to be served to you with fries. And why? What's the point? What is the return? William Dereskowitz, an excellent sheep, answers with more questions. What's the return on investment of education? What's the return on investment of having children, spending time with friends, listening to music, reading a book? The things that are most worth doing are worth doing for their own sake. Anyone who tells you that the sole purpose of education is the acquisition of negotiable skills is attempting to reduce you to a productive employee at work, a gullible consumer in the market, and a docile subject of the state. What's at stake when we ask what education is for is nothing less than our ability to remain fully human. What else can we do? This institution will be based on the illimitable freedom of the human mind. For here we are not afraid to follow truth wherever it may lead, nor to tolerate any error so long as reason is left free to combat it. I think that this simple phrase from Jefferson could be our battle cry and a solution to these three problems. And how can we ourselves be more intellectually brave? Are we intellectually inclined, and do we share our interests with others so as to be living examples of the examined life? I hope we can share ideas on how to do this when I'm done here in a minute. I think we still have a long way to go, and so does Gatto, as he writes, "In every important material respect, our nation is self-sufficient. If we gained a non-material philosophy that found meaning where it is genuinely located, in families, friends, the passage of the seasons, in nature, in simple ceremonies and rituals, in curiosity, generosity, compassion, and service to others, in a decent independence and privacy, then we would be truly self-sufficient." For example, did such simple and direct physiological functions as feeding become dining, copulation become love, the need for shelter turn into architecture, the impulse to fight into heroism. The record of these and similar transformations is the domain of the humanities. The humanities are my sword and the classroom is my battleground. So, as I tell my husband every morning when I pin on my Liberty name tag, "Well, honey, I'm off to battle ignorance." He wryly responds, "Good luck." Thank you.